Okie dokie, get seated, please, thank you. There's more interesting speakers coming later, so the longer this takes. Yeah, okay. So I'm apparently going to talk about hexagonal rails. Actually, I just initially wanted to talk about the backend of the project that Boris was talking about. But when the request for extra talks came, I was watching the hexagonal rails thingy from RailsConf, and I typed that, and then suddenly I have to do a talk about it. So yeah, let's go. So the topics, I'm just going to quickly recap the Railsway. I'm assuming that everybody knows kind of what the Railsway is. Then I'm going to go about explaining a bit what hexagonal rails is. And then I'm kind of going to explain what we did, which is kind of like a hybrid in between thingy approximation of both of them. So, the Railsway. What's the most important thing in Rails? MVC. Yeah, that is the main pattern that we all love. So when we, animation's not working. So model views controllers, yes. And helpers, maybe not everybody is so super duper enthusiastic about that. And then we also have the mailers folder and the assets folder, and God knows what Rails 5 is going to bring us. So, yay, Railsway, model view controller, and some stuff added to that. Next important thing in the Railsway, fat models, right? Which is basically, you take an active record model, add business logic to that, completely screw with single responsibility principles. So, Rails, woo, and good way. It leaves us though with still certain questions that, depending on who from the Rails core team you're talking to, might get different answers. Like, when and where do we send an email? Is that business logic? So it should be in the model, or is a mail a view? According to certain people, that is. So it should go into a controller. Although a mail itself is actually based on the same base class as a controller, which is kind of bizarre, a controller inside of a controller, but why not? How do you enqueue background jobs? Should that be, is that module logic? Is that controller logic? Should you completely hide that? Not much information there. To the point even that when they wanted to introduce queuing in Rails, that they just tore it out because it basically is like, we don't really know how to do that. Single responsibility, it's not only in active record, or at least how we build models, that is somewhat violated here and there. And well, if you're going to send emails from your controllers, how do you keep things dry? What if you have the same type of behavior in several locations? How do we do that? So that's kind of the Rails way. It's fairly well defined what there is, but it still has open questions, and it, for the most part, works when you want to build an application. What is hexagonal Rails now? Well, I don't necessarily want to talk about hexagonal Rails. I just want to talk about hexagonal applications. It's not something that's new in the world of building applications. So you can build hexagonal applications in the Rails framework if you want to. Because again, the Rails way is just a suggestion. Nobody is forcing you to do things that way. So this is kind of the famous drawing that was done at RailsConf. What does it come down to is that your business logic is in the center of an application, and anything that is really not business logic, so persistence, interfacing with the internet, interfacing with the console, rake task, administration tasks, message queues, etc., etc., should not be inside your business logic. You should put mappers and adapters and whatnot around that. So separate your domain from your implementation, kinda-ish. Certain patterns or certain things that are being used are form objects, request objects, service objects, domain objects, mappers. There's a lot of stuff that comes with that. And let's quickly go over the first three there for the fun of it. A form object what's the idea there is that inside your controller, the incoming parameters, you give them to an object that kind of matches the form that you render, and it will return to you entities or information about that without you having to deal directly with the parameters. That's fun. It's some abstraction. You don't have to directly deal with your parameters. You can put some validation in that form. It's nice. Then you have a request object, which you put in between the world and your controller, which basically what you do with that is you take your incoming parameters, give that to that object, and it's kind of nice because it does, you can ask some validation on it and get information from it. I don't know if you noticed that was kind of the exact same thing as this thing. Kind of. It's like, I'm not too familiar with that, but it sounds very, very similar. They both take parameters, they change it into something that returns entities, can do some validation on the request. For some reason, if an incoming request comes from a form, it needs a different way of approaching it. I don't know. One of the key things, though, is working with service objects. Your controllers don't contain the business logic. You have objects that contain the business logic, or at least will talk to the objects that contain the business logic. So these service objects become reusable. Multiple types of controllers can use different types of service objects. Certain service objects will call other service objects. They're basically your mapper in between your controller that talks to the world and what is going to be talking to your business entities. Or they might even, depending on what type of service it is, contain some of your business logic. And then a fourth pattern, which apparently was not in my list, sorry, is the repository pattern, where your services never deal with persistence, really. They talk to a repository. You can think data mapper style, where it is going to, the repository is going to talk to your data layer, which could be your models in the case of active record, or could be doing direct inserts, direct posts, deletes, etc. And they will return entities. They will never return active record objects. They will never return an object with persistence logic in it. Like active record should not be something that escapes the repository if you want to use active record. So, again, the list: form objects, request objects, service objects, entities, and then a whole bunch of mapper type objects, like active record is allowed as your model layer. You have your controllers, you might have your mailers, you might have mappers in between mappers if you need to, rescue, Redis, etc. Like those things still exist, but they should just be mapping one thing to another. If I got it right. Again, that was last week that I was watching that. So, things that I like about this is that, well, things that I think about it is that it really pushes for single responsibility. I like that. It keeps code clean, simple, and much less chance of building God objects. Today, there's still a lot of boilerplate that has to go around it because there's really not a framework or a set way of doing things, hexagonal in Rails. But on the other hand, it's easy to swap out certain components, kind of like Rails tries to do as well with MVC, I guess. But in Rails, yeah, you don't have to deal with boilerplate. You get much faster results if you build something the Rails way. It's easier, I guess. Well, not if you want to start from scratch. The thing is that I believe that each has its merits. If you want to build something fast, you want to prototype, you build something simple, go the Rails way, it's nice. When you start dealing with a lot of complexity just within your business logic, it makes sense to separate that away from your persistence layer, because suddenly your persistence layer might not be performant enough anymore, and then you have to use gems that will start introducing caching into active record, and it's suddenly doing three things: persistence, caching, and your business logic. there's a whole bunch of gems that hack on top of the Rails way to introduce extra things into models. Think about device, which dependent on how you modify your user object, you're going to be generating different routes. If that is not a way of mixing up things in your application, I don't know no more. The Rails way is really violating this thing of single responsibility, and I think that can create a lot of confusion, a lot of difficulty later on in an application, and you get to really start building God objects. So that was touching on hexagonal applications. How fast am I going? Whew, 10 minutes. Okay. So now, as to what we did. Note, the thing that I'm going to be talking about, we started somewhere November, December of last year. So we did hexagonal Rails before DHH hated it. Woo! Well, we didn't really do hexagonal Rails because it hadn't been coined yet, and what we do is not really exactly the same. So why did we move in a direction that looks like hexagonal Rails? Maybe it's pentagonal Rails, I don't know, whatever. So we have an application that's 6 years old. Whew, that has a little test and lack of specs. It's really nice talking to a client or to your internal client saying like, hey, that's not supposed to be that way. It's like, yes, it is. Why? Because the code does that. It's a huge application, not dry at all, and it has a lot of ad hoc design in it. I mean, over 6 years, you change your mind. This is an application that started before Rails 2. There's a lot of technical debt in there. There's a lot of change of mind. There's a lot of experiments. Like, I think we've been experimenting with service-oriented design or domain-driven design, whatever you want to call it, for the last 2.5 years. So there's remnants of those experiments in there. We also had a need to move away from the Rails way. There's low quality because not a lot of tests. We start getting regressions. You might say that's not the Rails way's fault. I agree, but anyways. Something had to change, so this was a need. There was a desire to start building a native mobile app, so we had to have an API suddenly. More documentation of the application, so the argument, because the code does it, would not have to be used anymore. And a very important one, hiring. I guess most of the people here who hire Rails developers or Ruby developers, really not that much in Belgium, or the ones they already have a job. So you want to diversify your team a bit. If you can say like, we're going to put a bunch of JavaScript kiddies on the front end, fine, API, back end. You need less Rails developers, hooray. So that. Where did we get inspiration from in the last 2.5 years? For me personally, event loops in games and how games deal with data in the sense that each part of the game just writes to a data store and the next part goes like, oh, it's like that. I don't care why, I'll deal with it. That's why you sometimes have those really stretchy faces because the face is 5 meters in front of the rest of the body. The renderer will say like, sure, no problem. A talk that was given in 2013 or 2012 on RCamp, Light Service, which is about how you can, well, I'll get into that in a second. Indempotent JavaScript rewrite that we did, so that each thing that JavaScript does is indempotent. So for those that don't know what indempotent is, you call the same action again and the final state will remain the same. So if the state change already happened, it will just back off. If it needs to modify something, it will. And then Martin Fowler's writings, and specifically Ruby Tapas, who brings it nicely in a very condensed format with a lot of information. If anything, you want to become a better Ruby developer in general, last line. Like, binge all the Ruby Tapas, seriously. So, all those needs, desires, and inspiration brought us to a new paradigm. A paradigm? Something? I'm going to coin it API-driven development. I don't know if that already exists. I don't know about it. I'm not saying API-driven design. The API does not define how we're going to design our application, but our development process, the steps we are going to take, were driven by our need for our API. So yeah, how do we go about that? So you have this old application, you need to put this a new fresh API on top of that, preferably an API that doesn't have to change too much because there's going to be a mobile app attached to it. So how do you go from this very organic application to a much more strict API, right? So we set up some rules. Rules are good. The Rails way proves us that that works. It's convention. These were our conventions. First of all, our API implements our future vision. Like, it's a 6-year-old application. We kind of know where we want to go with that, but it's going to take a while before we get there. The API fakes as if we're already there. So any type of technical debt that we still have, the API is not going to expose that anymore. One API endpoint will be one service object in the application. Literally, in the controller, you will see service object, new, call it, done. The service object must first be implemented in the old controller that currently does that functionality. So say we're going to have a create comment endpoint. We built the service object and we first put it in the old controller. It has to use it first because we have some integration tests there, so we'll know it works, or at least behaves the same. And spec the hell out of the services. So we were doing unit tests and stuff. The Rails way, we're saying, let's do that R spec. It's nicely separated. We can see the tests moving from one thing to another, and hopefully a total increase of coverage, which kind of worked, which is good. So the first type of service object we had, commands. What does it look like? I don't know if that's very readable. This is a create comment command. There's two major parts here which are important. Command permitted, which will check if the user is authorized to execute this command with the parameters given to it. And secondly, a list of individual actions that it will run through executing this command. This is from the light service gem, where you basically, there I think it's called an orchestrator, which will call and sequence a bunch of actions that will execute specific atomic parts of your job. So in our case, a create comment is first create a comment, important. Subscribe then to the thing that was commented on, notify the people that were mentioned, update the newsfeed, close transaction, because then after that is stuff that happens in the background, so it's not ideal yet. And then send out the emails or notify resource subscribers. That's a very bad naming. An example of such an action, this is the create comment action. First, it will handle two cases, a closed comment thread and an empty comment text, which will both erase and cancel the entire command. Then it just creates the comment, which is the point where it goes and talks to the database. And then if that succeeded, it locks some stuff away. It updates the context, which is the object that gets returned. Sorry if I'm going too fast, there's too much information. And then it does two interesting things. It adds to the newsfeed queue and add to the mention queue. And what it does at that point, it builds a message that it will add to a queue, which it puts on the object. And then, as you could see here, later on, there's two more actions that will actually process that. So it doesn't deal with the newsfeed. It doesn't deal with the logic of mentioning. It just knows, oh, something got mentioned here. I'll add that to the queue of mentioned things with a reference to myself. And then the next actions will process that. If we, for instance, at some point don't want to deal with the newsfeed anymore, here we just erase the action. And the previous, we erase the update newsfeed action. And it will be the newsfeed will be taken out. All the previous objects that are still writing to that queue, fine. They can. But it won't be processed anymore. Or, alternatively, much more interesting, is that we could change the implementation of those two methods where when you write to the newsfeed queue, it immediately writes, for instance, to Redis. where it immediately gets processed in the background and not in the foreground anymore, without having to change any of the actions. The only point that we would have to change is the orchestrator, or the command. So here then you have the updates newsfeed, which basically calls another proxy because our newsfeed is 3 years old and we didn't want to rewrite it yet, so we just put a proxy in there or a map or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't really deal with that, it just pushes it to another service. So, commands and actions. Commands will do validation and authentication of what's about to happen. They call the actions, obviously. And in our case, it optionally logs what is happening and puts it in a transaction. So if any part of it fails, that the entire transaction is rolled back. An action implements one unit of the main logic, adding something to the newsfeed, dealing with mentions, creating a comment. Yeah, that's not that reusable, but it's one logical action. Subscribing to a resource. Okay, I'm going to go faster. Subscribing to a resource. Those are things which are reusable. It is a point that will be interfacing with our storage layer, any storage layer we have, and we try to make them reusable. Boom. This is how we implemented in the old controller. Here you have the part that is calling the action, and there's a whole bunch of craft around that to make it work without changing our views and helpers. This is how it looks in our API controller. Like I said, one line. Well, okay, and this bit as well that builds the information. But this is literally coming from our code base. This is our API controllers. Fun. And you might notice there on line 10, there's next up query patterns. Going a bit faster. I had to redo my coloring, so my text is somewhat off. Sorry. Our queries, basically what they will do is how to retrieve data from our store. They do it all in a very similar way. That's not that well defined as our comments yet, because we didn't have a very good example, so we really have to figure it out ourselves. It will always return a collection, period, an enumerable set. There's no questions asked. It will paginate itself automatically. So every query that you do to a query object, you will get a paginated collection back with cursor information that you can immediately use to render in your views or in your API views or in your HTML views with Caminari or whatever. It will do the sorting for you and then adjust its cursor based on how you've been sorting. And it has scopes, which are other classes, which are basically like queries inside of queries, where you can say, like, for instance, I don't only want the messages, I want the messages from this inbox. And that is a new object that contains that logic on how to reduce this base scope to just that scope. And you could say, like, yeah, Rails, all fun and dandy. Why not just use active record scopes for that? Good question, a good point as well. It's just in our case, each of these query objects can do internal optimizations for what they have to return. In our case, because we are future focused, we have an endpoint called resources, where all our major data is, and that is actually representing 12 tables or 12 active record objects in the database on one endpoint. You can imagine how fun it is when they ask one specific ID, because you have to loop over all these tables to check where it is. So it has internal optimizations for that. It will cache that UID, that class, that UID, that class. So it can optimize itself without the outside world needing to know what's going on in there. Then we have our presenters. I'm going to go a bit faster over that. What do? They just do all the presentation logic. We take it out of the model. Like, for instance, if there's no subject on a conversation, you say no title. Because title, subject, interchangeable words. We don't put that in the model anymore. It's a presentation problem. Our collection presenters that present the entire collection will actually do optimization of loading of data, which shouldn't be there, but currently it is, just how it is. I'm going to go a bit faster over that. So what do we still have to do? We need better naming conventions and structure, because we kind of have mixed our base logic with our implementation. They're on the same level, it's not that nice, and the names are also too much namespaces to be good. We need to a bit better define how queries work. And instead of having our presenters optimize the loading of their linked data. It would be nice if the query result, like if you query, say, a conversation, that you could ask that same object, like, oh, and can I also have all the messages for all those conversations in you? That would be much nicer. And actually, that implementation could use another query object again. Advantages, command query separation. On a class level, a set of methods. We know now exactly what our application does, because pretty much anything it can do is defined in a class. We can test our commands and actions in absolute separation from each other. And each layer has the advantage that it can hide complexity for the next layer. And we have seen that that has actually been very useful to us. Like I mentioned, the resource query that we have is being used by a few other queries, and they don't have to deal with that optimization at all. They just ask the resource query, hey, can I have that object? They get it. It has done the caching and optimizations internally. It has done transformations if it needs to as well. So we still have some open questions, things that we don't really know what to do. Should our commands use our query objects internally? Because they write to the store, so why can't they directly read from the store? Should our commands accept primitives? At this point, when you build a command, when you give it the parameters, for instance, the current user, you have to pass it the object user. It won't accept the user ID. That's something that we're thinking, like maybe the command should be able to turn primitives into the objects it needs. Should commands return collections like queries? At this point, commands return a specific context, a whole bunch of objects at the same time. Maybe it would be nicer, at least for the controllers, that it returns something that's compatible with what the queries return. And at this point, these collections are basically active record associations, or at least an array of active record objects. Maybe we want to do what the hexagonal Rails thing does, and it's just return entities. We were initially thinking of just returning an array of hashes all the time and not deal with it. But that's really, really difficult for dealing with migrating such a big application. So, check what we did. So, I'm done with my presentation. There's pizza. But before pizza, are there any questions? Want to discuss something? Yes, please. So the question is if we would start from scratch, knowing what I know now, would we do the same thing? I love Catch 2020 questions. Probably. Maybe we would look into another framework. Maybe we wouldn't deal with MVC anymore at all. We might just work with direct data manipulation and only service objects, no entities at all. I don't know. I haven't. The thing is, I specifically on the job, I try not to deal with questions, what if? So for this specific project, I don't know. But I would really recommend stepping away from mixing your business logic with your implementation logic, however far you want to pull that. But above all, step away from the active record pattern. I'm not meaning active record to gem, because it can still be useful, well, Arrow is. The one thing I would do now if I start from scratch is not use active record. That's the main thing that I take away. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm going to try to turn your statement into a question. I was a remark. So the remark was that the advantage of having pattern models is that it's easier to follow the logic of what's going on. I would agree with that code that belongs together should be together. But the thing is that the idea of a two-fat model is that there's a whole bunch of code that you can basically draw tiny islands around inside of one model. We call them concerns now, according to the Rails way. I don't think it's a good thing to put that all into the same model. They just aren't. The fact that you can isolate them into a concern means that they're probably extractable to a separate class. I would then also recommend doing that. A nice example where you say that it's easy to follow the flow of code is, for instance, deal with paperclip or with device and any model and try to follow the flow of that code. It just shouldn't be there. A better alternative for paperclip would be carrier wave. Cleaner, it's clearer what is going on because it puts the logic of specific things in specific classes instead of mixing it in all over the place. Instead of device, use pure warden. Well, actually, no. What we do is we have device loaded, but we don't require it, and we just take the specific strategies and load those, but try to do direct warden still. Okay. So the question is, how do actions which are called by one command, how do they know about what the other actions have done? Yeah? Okay. So there's a context object which is passed around. So each action works in an idempotent fashion. Say, for instance, take the create comment action. If it doesn't see a resource to comment on, it'll explode and stop the entire command because it is supposed to do that. The action that processes the newsfeed queue, if it doesn't see the newsfeed queue or it doesn't see any messages on the newsfeed queue, it is built to just be there in case it's needed. So it will just silently fail and let that pass unless we would configure the context to like tell it to like there has to be something in the newsfeed, so explode if you don't. So that's the thing. There's one context object built by the command. That's also where the validation happens. Like, is this context complete? Is this context authorized? Like, are you commenting on something you're allowed to see? And then it will call the actions. And the actions just behave without knowing what the other actions were. They just deal with the context of that. Mm-hmm. So, uh, yeah, okay. So the question is, how do we test this? Because it already looks fairly complex. So how do we do our test specifically command action based? So Not in an ideal fashion, for starters, I'll admit. Our actions, we test in isolation, because we know what they expect and we know what they have to do. And we kind of smoke test them. We just say, like, action, I'll call you, has this happened? And we include the database in that. We don't care. It's like, screw it. Database is an integral part of what we do, because we store data. It's going to be part of it. Our commands, when we validate if it's authorized, because our validation system today is still in Rails, it's going to be using the database as well. But we do specifically check it's just, are you calling these actions without loading the actions themselves? We just check if the order is fine in that sense. And then there's a whole bunch of like helper objects, like the context object and things like that, that we also unit test, the newsfeed queue and all these things. Those are also being unit tested separately. I hope that helps or satisfies as an answer. So the question is if we have full CQRS or no. It's a first step that we took. We still are very dependent on active records, specifically active record relations. We still return active record models from our queries. We still do that. The thing is, though, that we're fairly sure if we would have our queries return read-only objects, nothing would break. We're fairly sure if we would now put every data connection that our queries use on a read-only connection, that would be fine. If we would just decide to return simple objects, entities, not full active record objects, it would still work because we have our presenter layer in between as well. We had to make the trade-off. Do we build this entire extra thing of recasting all these things, or are we just going to use what Rails already gave us? And that in its own would be a sinkhole of 3 months. So no, we didn't. We still use active record, but the thing is it's completely hidden from the controller. The presenters don't care whatever they get. Some of them get structs, some of them get active record models. They don't care. As long as they can call a method, it's fine. So no, it's not ideal, but it's a lot cleaner in a sense. And it allows us to move towards a more, well, to move towards a world without active record. It's my pet peeve, sorry. Maybe one more question, if there's somebody. And if not, there's pizza. I think pizza is better, right? All right, thank you for your attention.